Imagine yourself standing in ancient Egypt, chosen as the royal embalmer. One day, you are summoned for a task unlike any you've ever faced. Before you lies the lifeless body of the pharaoh's queen, resting upon cold stone. But this is no ordinary embalming. The command you've been given defies every sacred ritual you have ever sworn to uphold, and the reason behind it chills your very soul. This is not mythology. These are the shadows of history, rituals and hidden practices so disturbing that even today they would unsettle the modern mind. We grow up believing ancient Egypt was only pyramids, divine pharaohs and rivers of gold. Yet, buried beneath the sands lies a much darker truth. There were customs so extreme that Victorian archaeologists deliberately concealed their findings. Royal families were sometimes entangled in acts that blurred the boundaries of power, bloodline, and devotion. And festivals intended to honor the gods often spiraled into days, sometimes weeks, of chaos, excess, and unrestrained ritual celebration. This was the Egypt that textbooks chose to forget. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of the greatest civilizations in history. The truth about Egypt's secret rituals was so unsettling that museums around the world suppressed the evidence for more than a century. Between 3100 BC and 30 BC, along the fertile banks of the Nile, the Egyptians developed traditions that would shock even the most open-minded today. These practices weren't simply about private pleasure or religious ceremony. They were about cosmic balance, divine authority, and the deliberate use of human intimacy as a tool of political control. The pharaohs were never seen as mere kings. They were living gods, believed to embody the very survival of Egypt. Their personal lives were thought to determine the fertility of the Nile, the success of the harvest, and the endurance of the kingdom itself. This created enormous pressure to display divine potency through increasingly extreme rituals. The evidence does not come from tourist sites or popular exhibits, but from hidden temple inscriptions, fragile papyri too controversial to display, and archaeological discoveries Victorian scholars intentionally locked away. When 19th century explorers first encountered provocative imagery carved into tombs and temples, they were so scandalized that many artifacts were either destroyed or sealed away in private vaults, never intended for public eyes. Egyptian culture was built on the principle that life force itself was cosmic energy. Every act of closeness carried the potential to become a ritual. Moments of intimacy were considered dialogues with the gods, and physical gestures could serve as forms of prayer. This worldview blurred the lines between worship and desire, between sacred duty and human instinct, creating a society where devotion and intimacy became inseparable. What may be most unsettling is not only the practices themselves, but the way Victorian scholars worked to erase them. Early Egyptologists, when confronted with controversial imagery or evidence of bodily alteration, did not simply overlook it, they actively suppressed it, removing artifacts from public view, sanitizing excavation reports, and reshaping history to fit their own moral standards. For more than a century, the true scale of Egypt's hidden rituals was obscured, not by ancient secrecy, but by modern prudishness and Victorian morality. And missing parts of the body were only the surface of a much larger system. Egyptian society operated through a strict hierarchy of control over intimacy. At the top stood the pharaohs, whose private lives were believed essential for the survival of Egypt itself. Beneath them, nobles and priests faced immense pressure to demonstrate devotion through ritualized displays. At the lowest level were the household servants, often children, subjected to exploitation that was not merely tolerated, but justified as a religious obligation. For children born into the noble families of ancient Egypt, life often led down a tragic path. Historical records suggest that the ruling class would dedicate its youngest members to service in the temples from a very early age. Within these institutions, some as young as 6 or 7 were taught that their bodies were not their own but instruments for divine purpose. The training they received was both comprehensive and exceptionally harsh. The children were instructed in various ritual practices designed for use in religious ceremonies. The aim was to disconnect them from personal identity, compelling them to view their bodies as sacred tools rather than private property. Medical papyri reveal the profound toll this rigorous training took on young bodies. The demanding physical conditioning often led to chronic injuries. Furthermore, their growth was deliberately stunted through malnutrition, a practice intended to preserve childlike proportions favored within elite culture. Many did not survive to adulthood, succumbing to the consequences of such practices at an early age. This exploitation was not confined to the temples. The use of enslaved children within the households of wealthy Egyptian families was also widespread. Surviving legal documents confirm that these children could be bought and sold for specialized purposes, with their value determined by age, appearance, and training. The psychological impact of these experiences was devastating. Survivors who reached adulthood displayed symptoms that modern psychology would identify as severe trauma. Many struggled to form meaningful relationships, often becoming either compulsive in their behaviors or completely withdrawn. Ancient texts describe their condition as a broken heart, a phrase that carries chilling resonance even today. What makes this even more unsettling is the way such practices were justified through religious doctrine. The priesthood taught that serving the gods in ritual capacities was the highest form of devotion. As a result, children chosen for this role were not viewed as victims, but portrayed as divinely blessed. Families were conditioned to believe it was an honor when their child was selected for temple service, even when they quietly understood the grim reality. The system was also driven by economics, adding another disturbing dimension. Archaeological evidence suggests a staggering mortality rate among temple children, with some studies pointing to extreme procedures that could last for hours. Wealthy elites invested vast resources to sustain this structure, turning it into an organized institution that endured for centuries. And yet, if you believe this was the darkest chapter in Egypt's treatment of its youth, you are mistaken. Because overshadowing even this systemic exploitation was an event so infamous that it horrified the very archaeologists who uncovered it, the Festival of Drunkenness. The practices associated with this celebration were considered so extreme that early scholars allegedly destroyed some records rather than allow them to be translated for the public. What I am about to describe will make everything you have heard so far seem like only a prelude. This festival fused religious worship with unrestrained excess on a scale that shocks even modern sensibilities. For days on end, the entire civilization is believed to have descended into ritualized chaos. And the most chilling part? Archaeological and textual evidence suggests it truly happened, just as the ancient sources described. Before we plunge into the most unsettling part of this story, hit the like button if you think you can handle what's coming next. And be sure to drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from. I find it incredible that people from all corners of the world are connected by the same fascination with the darkest chapters of our collective history. The Festival of Drunkenness represented the absolute peak of ritual excess in Egypt. This annual event, devoted to the goddess Hathor, submerged the entire civilization into a week-long ordeal of sanctioned frenzy and religious passion. What began as a celebration of the divine feminine spiraled into something that, by modern standards, would be considered deeply disturbing. The festival's origins are rooted in Egyptian mythology, particularly the story of the lion goddess Sekhmet, who nearly wiped out humanity in her rage. According to legend, the gods filled the land with beer mixed with red ochre. Sekhmet, mistaking it for blood, drank until she was so intoxicated that she abandoned her destructive mission and transformed back into the gentler Hathor. This myth served as the blueprint for an annual event where every Egyptian was encouraged to surrender to a state of divine intoxication. But the festival went far beyond simple drinking. Participants believed themselves to be channels for the gods, free to act on impulses without fear of earthly consequences. Preparations began months in advance. Temple officials brewed vast quantities of beer, sometimes enhanced with botanicals such as the lotus flower, creating mixtures intended to alter perception and loosen inhibitions. People reported vivid visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling as though they were possessed by supernatural entities. When the festival began, the normal framework of society dissolved. For 7 days and 7 nights, Egypt descended into orchestrated chaos. Ancient records describe scenes that still shock modern readers. The rigid social hierarchy inverted, with the lines between noble and commoner, master and servant, blurred in displays of ecstatic devotion. It is said that even married women would leave their families to join the wandering bands of celebrants. The usual protections of age and status disappeared, as the young were exposed to ceremonies normally reserved for adults. Crowds of intoxicated revelers reportedly stormed through towns, breaking into homes and compelling the occupants to join their ranks. In what was framed as a form of sacred communion, women took part in elaborate rituals, while men competed in contests of endurance, pushing their bodies to extremes under the influence of drink. The festival was marked by violence as much as excess. Participants, overwhelmed by ecstatic frenzy, often injured themselves or one another, with wounds interpreted as marks of divine favor. Some reportedly died from the intensity of these physical rites, while others were trampled in the crush of the drunken crowds filling narrow city streets. What made it even more unsettling was the theology behind it. The priesthood proclaimed that any action performed during the festival was inherently sacred, because participants were vessels of divine spirits. By this reasoning, brutality could be reimagined as holy sacrifice, and the suffering of the weak twisted into an offering to the gods. Foreign envoys left scathing accounts of these events. Mesopotamian visitors described the festival as proof that Egypt was a land of chaos, cloaked in civilization. Some kingdoms even refused to send diplomats during this period, fearing what they called moral corruption. The aftermath was as traumatic as the festival itself. Many participants awoke from their intoxicated haze with no memory of their actions, left to confront a deep sense of shame and psychological turmoil when faced with the evidence of what had occurred. Families were torn apart by revelations of what members had done, and children conceived during the festival were often stigmatized as the product of divine frenzy rather than ordinary life. The economic impact was equally astonishing. Entire cities shut down for a week as the population surrendered to intoxicated celebration. Agriculture stalled, trade ceased, and government ground to a halt. The cost in lost productivity was immense. There was also a political purpose behind the festival. It acted as a safety valve for social tensions, allowing the Egyptian system to maintain a rigid hierarchy for most of the year. For this one carefully managed period of chaos, citizens could push back against authority, masters could be humbled by servants, and social norms could be inverted, ensuring that order returned once the celebrations ended. And for anyone tempted to dismiss these accounts as exaggeration, the archaeological record offers sobering support. Excavations of temple complexes have revealed specialized chambers, apparently designed for collective ritual activities, featuring architectural elements that seem to align with the disturbing descriptions preserved by ancient scribes. The decline of this ritual culture began during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Hellenistic values on Egyptian religious life. This clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian mysticism created a cultural crisis that proved destabilizing for both. The Ptolemies, as foreign pharaohs, were obligated to participate in Egyptian festivals to maintain legitimacy, yet their Greek sensibilities were often horrified by the extremes of what they witnessed. Cleopatra I attempted to reform the Festival of Drunkenness by reducing its duration and curbing its most disruptive public practices. These changes, however, triggered a severe religious backlash. The native priesthood argued that altering sacred tradition would invite the wrath of the gods and bring cosmic disaster. They even pointed to natural calamities, military defeats, and economic troubles as evidence that the gods were already angered by foreign interference. This cultural conflict reached its height during the reign of Cleopatra III, who faced the impossible task of reconciling Egyptian religious expectations with Roman political sensitivities. Roman observers, scandalized by these rituals, interpreted them as proof of cultural decay. Meanwhile, Egyptian priests threatened revolt if the ancient festivals were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's solution was an act of political desperation. She created private, uncensored versions of the festivals for the Egyptian religious elite, while presenting a far more subdued public spectacle for Roman eyes. This compromise ultimately pleased no one. It fostered a culture of hypocrisy that undermined the authority of Egyptian religion and the credibility of Roman power. In this climate, exploitation became even more deeply hidden. Rulers, desperate to prove their commitment to Egyptian tradition while concealing the evidence from Roman scrutiny, pushed the practices further underground. Vulnerable children were caught in the middle, confined to secret chambers that Roman officials were never permitted to enter. The psychological toll on Egyptian society was immense. Generations had grown up within a system that normalized extreme ritual practices. When outside pressure forced change, Egyptians experienced a kind of collective cultural trauma. They had lost more than their traditions. They had lost the framework through which they understood the human body, spirituality, and their connection to the divine. The final death blow was delivered by the Roman conquest in 30 BC. Augustus Caesar was reportedly horrified by what his legions uncovered within Egyptian temples, and he immediately ordered the suppression of these controversial rites. Roman soldiers defaced murals, burned manuscripts, and punished priests who refused to renounce the old ceremonies. But the Romans did not merely suppress these customs, they attempted to erase their very memory. Temples were stripped of imagery, papyri were destroyed, and architectural features built for ritual purposes were sealed off. The children who had been raised inside this system faced tragic outcomes. Many were so conditioned for a life of ritual service that they struggled to adapt to ordinary society. Roman accounts speak of disoriented survivors, unable to find purpose once the traditions had collapsed. The trauma of these practices rippled through Egyptian culture for generations, leaving behind underground sects and clandestine movements attempting to revive what Rome had tried to bury forever.
Yet even the Romans could not erase all the evidence. What they left behind would later shock Victorian archaeologists into perpetrating one of the greatest cover-ups in scientific history. The modern concealment of Egypt's ritual traditions was not born of ancient conspiracies, but of a Victorian moral sensibility that could not process the archaeological reality. When 19th century explorers first unearthed provocative imagery in Egyptian tombs, they triggered a cultural crisis that would define Egyptology for the next 150 years. The whitewashing began almost immediately. When Giovanni Belzoni discovered murals with highly controversial themes in the tomb of Seti I in 1817, he ordered them plastered over rather than documenting them. His published findings described the tomb as containing beautiful religious imagery, completely ignoring the material that covered the walls of several chambers. This became standard practice throughout the Victorian era. Auguste Mariette, a founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, kept private collections of sensitive artifacts that were never shown to the public. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was founded, entire categories of objects were relegated to restricted archives, accessible only to a small circle of male scholars. The suppression extended beyond imagery. Victorian translators systematically removed sensitive content from ancient texts, either replacing explicit descriptions with sanitized euphemisms or omitting entire passages. The celebrated Ebers Papyrus, one of Egypt's most important medical documents, contained dozens of sections addressing intimate practices. These sections remained untranslated until the 1970s. Perhaps the most shocking element was the deliberate destruction of evidence. The influential British archaeologist Flinders Petrie admitted in his private journals to destroying artifacts he deemed too controversial for public knowledge. He recorded burning papyri and breaking statues and carvings that depicted acts he could not bring himself to document. This cover-up extended into the halls of academia. Universities often refused to fund research into Egypt's intimate traditions, considering it an inappropriate subject for scholarly study. Students who pursued the topic were discouraged or even expelled. Academic journals rejected submissions that discussed these practices, regardless of how well supported they were by archaeological evidence. Museums created complex systems to conceal sensitive artifacts. The British Museum alone is estimated to hold over 2,800 restricted Egyptian items, intentionally mislabeled as assorted vases or ornamental fragments, and stored away in private archives. Even as recently as 2019, the Louvre was revealed to be withholding newly discovered papyri from public access. To this day, Wikipedia articles touching on these topics are often mysteriously locked to prevent editing. Visitors who specifically request to view these hidden objects face a maze of bureaucratic obstacles,
intentionally designed to discourage curiosity. New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art maintains similar restrictions today. Its Egyptian galleries display sanitized reproductions of tomb murals, in which the more controversial content has been obscured or digitally removed. The authentic works remain locked away in storage, accessible only to vetted researchers who can prove an academic purpose and agree to strict non-disclosure terms. Even now, this Victorian legacy continues to dictate the public's perception of ancient Egypt. Mainstream documentaries and museum exhibitions focus on political history, religious mythology, and artistic achievements, while entirely avoiding the intimate rituals that were central to Egyptian culture. The result is a sterilized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often unsettling truth of this civilization. This ongoing concealment has left vast gaps in the public understanding of human intimacy, spiritual expression, and social order in one of history's most pivotal civilizations. The evidence inscribed in Egyptian tombs and texts reveals how religious devotion could transform into systemic exploitation when physicality was treated as an instrument of cosmic power. For 3 millennia, Egyptian society built traditions that blurred the boundaries between faith and the body, sanctifying acts of control and endurance as divine necessity. If this journey into the hidden darkness of history has left you wanting to unearth more buried truths, I have another expedition into the shadows of the past prepared that you won't want to miss. Click the video now appearing on your